Special thanks to Colin Fagan, Luke McDonald, and Teddy Hardy Lee for becoming our newest Southpaw supporters and helping to make this project possible. The global pandemic has hit our day jobs hard. This is now our full-time jobs. If you want great content and can afford a few extra bucks, consider becoming a Southpaw supporter on Patreon. If you want to show everyone else your solidarity, we now have an online store full of Southpaw swag. You can find links to both our store and our Patreon at southpawpod.com. When it comes to Left Media, we cannot exist without your support.
This is Sam.
This is Jacky.
And this is Southpaw.
Today on Southpaw, we have queer self-defense and martial arts trainer, Jacky. Hi, Jacky.
Hey, Sam. How's it going?
So I've spoken to a lot of trainers from inclusive gyms, red gyms, and anti-fascist gyms. But I haven't met a lot of MMA fans. And I think you're the first I've met who's a real MMA enthusiast. That's why I wanted to learn more about your community project, but also talk with you about UFC 250, Nunes versus Spencer. So let's start with this. How did your interest in combat sports start?
Well, that's kind of a complicated question. I'll try to keep it sort of short. I don't know. So that's almost like the story of my whole life, right? It's kind of hard to pick like a moment. As a kid, there's lots of interest in martial arts and stuff from cartoons and etc. But it wasn't super accessible, so I didn't really stick with it. And then it didn't seem like something that was very necessary as an adult. I was training parkour for a long time, and I thought that would be enough to just kind of keep myself out of situations. And then I ended up actually in an abusive relationship, and that kind of did a lot of things to me, including, sort of suppressing my personality a lot. And when I finally did have the courage and opportunity to leave that situation, I went through a very transformative period where I was kind of rediscovering who I was, including coming out as an adult. And I decided that martial arts was something I wanted to pursue more in earnest, and also because it felt more urgent to myself personally as a skill set that I wanted to have to be able to physically defend my boundaries or protect someone else if I was in a situation that I couldn't just leave on my own.
So a lot of people then might just be interested in the self-defense aspect. That's the thing I found with other instructors is they're interested in that or the techniques. They're not necessarily fans of watching MMA or geeking out on jiu-jitsu videos online. So how did you go from just an initial interest in self-defense to becoming a fan of combat sports?
I think that kind of came just from experience a little bit. I had watched some MMA in college with some friends. They kind of introduced it to me, but I didn't really appreciate all of the nuance until I started training and trying to figure it out for myself. And I've always been very interested in movement patterns and stuff like that. I skateboarded as a teenager, so trying to like analyze and figure out how to perform a movement has always been something that draws me to things. And so when I started practicing, I would say specifically the jiu-jitsu, it just it really lit up the problem solving aspect in my brain.
Did you find it similar to parkour at all, as far as like the way it made your mind think about problem solving?
Yeah, definitely. Doing other disciplines, there's always a problem solving aspect to it. But with martial arts, having another person that you're engaging with adds a new randomized element to it that keeps you very alert and very engaged and having to constantly reevaluate things. Whereas with parkour or with climbing or even with skateboarding, you kind of have a set line of motions that you're trying to do. And, maybe in the middle of something, you might have to make an adjustment on the fly, but it's not the same kind of constant reading of a situation and changing to accommodate. And so I think that really drew me to martial arts and kept me engaged in that fun way rather than just the I need this to protect myself kind of way. I really just fell in love with it.
I think you're the first person to mention that, because like with parkour or with rock climbing, skateboarding, anything like that, right? These are fixed objects you're trying to circumvent and go around or move on top of. So maybe even if you're unfamiliar with it at first, it's not moving once you're on it. Maybe the skateboard is moving, but the ramp is fixed. The wall is fixed. The holes are fixed. Whereas with jiu-jitsu, all of these things are constantly in motion and in flux.
Exactly. And with something like climbing, you can go to a different route and do things differently. And there's that interesting kind of everyone climbs it a little bit differently, but there's not a whole lot of engagement in going back to the same place and doing it over again. And then there's a lot of kind of travel involved in finding new obstacles. Whereas with martial arts, it's just another person. You can just be in a room and find infinite possibilities with each other.
As an enthusiast of Eastern philosophy, I've always found with martial arts, and especially jiu-jitsu, a parallel with the concept of impermanence. Things are always in flux, and you're never going to have the same situation twice. Nothing is permanent. Everything is up for change. And why I find that interesting is because the culture is not like that, right? The art is impermanent. It's always in change, but the culture can get so toxic and have these like absolute ideas about what is correct, what is right, how people should act and be, you know?
Oh, for sure. For sure.
So it sounds like you had the reverse path to combat sports to a lot of people. What I mean by that is a lot of people are first fans of combat sports and then they go train. But for you, you develop your enthusiasm for combat sports after doing it yourself and after trying it and experiencing it.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that I was a fan in that kind of a conceptual way. I was really into martial arts movies, and Dragon Ball was a big influence when I was younger. But combat sports always seemed like kind of a separate thing to me for a long time, until my exposure to MMA as a younger adult. It seemed kind of something that bullies do, and I didn't want to be around that.
And so in training, your perception of it changed?
Yeah, absolutely. In experiencing it firsthand, I realized that it could be, much more than just learning how to do violence to other people, and much more so about learning how to maintain and enforce your own boundaries. And I think that's another thing that I really, really liked about it. Again, especially with the jiu-jitsu, just because it's, something you can practice a little bit more safely with inexperienced people, that you can, it was almost like exposure therapy for me, where I'm being put in these situations that feel very similar to the high pressure situations I had been in before in real life, but I could kind of flip the script on my mind and push through it and kind of learn that I'm capable of fighting for myself.
So that's how you ended up watching MMA and training MMA and grappling. But what made you realize self-defense training in the queer and trans space was needed?
So my experience in discovering my own queer and trans identity was very much around the same time that I started training. And so there was this escalated sense of danger for myself, and realizing that that was probably very much also the case for uh, everyone else in the community. I had experienced a lot of gender-based bullying as a kid and didn't really connect that until much later, when I was, going through this kind of renaissance of self-discovery. So in some ways, it was selfishly motivated in me trying to find training partners. And, knowing that there was a specific need in the specific area, and me wanting to try to bring this new love and method of, learning boundary enforcement to a community that I knew desperately needed it and was, very widely excluded from those training environments like I was.
So when I speak to people about starting their own training collective, a lot of people will say, but I'm only a beginner. I can't do that. Because even if you are anti-hierarchy, we still buy into it for martial arts. And maybe it goes back to the movies we grew up on, as you mentioned. But you started your project around the same time you started training. Was there some trepidation on your part about doing that?
Absolutely, there was some. Like I said, it was in some ways motivated by me trying to find training partners, but also, I didn't want to position myself as a teacher, as someone who was fairly new to the whole thing. It initially very much was kind of just me creating a space and saying, here's somewhere that we can do this. If you're interested, or if you're someone who's queer and already doing this, please come and share your knowledge. We'll keep doing this. And there was a few people who had some experience that came through in the early days, and have kind of come through here and there, but no one else who really stepped up and said, hey, I have this experience. I'll come and train this. And I think that's, largely because if you do have that experience, you probably have a gym that you're in that you feel comfortable in, and going to, some white belt's basement 3 times a week is not particularly appealing.
So it sounds like at first you were just organizing a space and you were looking to do a skill share. Is that how it is years later, or is it more of a curriculum now?
I definitely have a kind of curriculum that I continue to evolve and add to, but anyone who has experience and knowledge and wants to come into the space and share that is perfectly welcome to, as long as, they're respectful of everyone and, the space and stuff. One of the more recent frequent participants has some boxing experience, and is also a yoga teacher, and she's helped to lead some stuff with that.
So then it's not just grappling.
I teach anything and everything that I know, that I feel comfortable teaching. Jiu-jitsu is certainly the thing that I'm the most comfortable teaching, and I have the most personal experience with, as far as training and also competing. But I'll teach whatever I can, whatever I know. That includes aspects of judo, wrestling, different types of kickboxing. People will often ask situational kinds of questions, and we'll workshop them. I've done some study in knife defense. I'm always trying to expand my own skill set so that I can share that with other people, and help them work through whatever. But I always try to make sure I'm never giving people a definitive answer to a problem that I haven't, fully worked myself through or learned from someone who's much more experienced than me.
Now, do you cover a lot of actual self-defense scenarios, or when you train or teach grappling or jiu-jitsu, do you just train it as the art and allow people to learn the art and apply it as they see fit?
It's a little bit of both. I generally will teach, it's mostly jiu-jitsu. And I try to, stick to what I really know. But I also try to give people options, for each of those things. So for instance, if I'm teaching, passing, I'm going to include, ways and scenarios that, you might do that if someone is trying to punch you or kick you or what have you. And I always try to emphasize, the goal is to disengage, if you can, right? That's the goal in self-defense, is to get away safely and minimize the damage to yourself. But if you're in, I don't know, let's say a locked room or in your own home with someone who you live with, you might have to engage a little more, right? Passing in a jiu-jitsu scenario is not something that you're hopefully usually going to have to use, because when you're standing up over someone, you can get away from them. But that might not always be the case, and I don't ever want to assume that that will be the case.
So you might be in a situation where you need to restrain them in some way.
Yeah.
Do you find that teaching has helped your own learning?
Oh, absolutely. I definitely think that teaching increases your own knowledge and ability in a much more rapid kind of way. And, part of that is because I'm teaching, or at least I started teaching, and I continue to in many ways, from instructionals. I'll find DVDs from, various black belts on different subjects and absorb it as much as I can. And then I communicate those details to the people who show up to my program. And that helps kind of reinforce in my head what's going on. And then I'll go back and review and find things that I missed from those things. And then I'll learn different things from coaches and people that I train with. And being able to take implicit knowledge and skill ability and make it explicit by describing it and communicating it to someone helps your own understanding a lot. And also finding different ways to communicate things to people who have different ways that they're better at learning something is really important. So I think my skill set as a teacher has also improved as I've done that a lot.
Now, as a trainer, but also a fan of combat sports, do you ever see something interesting in a fight and then show it in class, kind of like a workshop?
Oh, absolutely. I try to pull examples from those things. But I'm definitely inspired by things that I see in MMA and in grappling situations, and then try to add them to my repertoire so that I can communicate them to my students, I guess. I would say seeing how Khabib wrist rides people and drags them off of fences was definitely something that I started incorporating more into the classes, because that's not something that you see a lot in traditional jiu-jitsu spaces, is just maintaining that kind of top control, because there's not a lot of submission opportunities. But that's something that is extremely important in a potential self-defense situation.
So you mentioned also having to need training partners. So are you part of any commercial gym?
So in that vein, I've never actually trained at a commercial gym outside of like the free week of classes. I think when I first started, I had gotten some like really, really old school Gracie VHS rips or something like that, and like kind of started analyzing that myself. And then I took a free class at a local place. I did like, I think 4 sessions and maybe a Muay Thai class as well. And I was like, this is really cool. I have to keep doing it, but it's $200 a month. I'm going to use what I've got to buy some mats and quit my job as a dishwasher.
Wow. So this is kind of incredible because I've spoken to you a lot, and your knowledge of martial arts, especially jiu-jitsu, is quite extensive. So I was assuming that you must be doing the typical like training at a gym somewhere, just nerding out with other people. But you're like old school when there were no black belts in America, training on your own and just like kind of self-training with friends and just putting things together and getting good that way.
Yeah, I binge watch instructionals like other people, binge watch regular television. I do that too. But, I probably spend, or maybe not right now, but certainly in the first 2 years, easily 20 hours a week just watching and rewatching instructionals. Ryan Hall's stuff was really influential. I think the first one I had was Gracie Combatives, which was great because it was a linear thing that I could introduce other people to while I was learning it at the same time. Rob Bernanke's instructionals are really good for conceptual understanding. And then when Danaher started coming out with his stuff, I just have been gobbling that up.
So then you're mostly self-study, training with partners, and then also going to any community training that you can. But then to make sure that you're actually getting better, then you go out and compete.
Yeah. Try to test myself in those situations. I think it's a good experience for anybody who's training to try to compete a few times. It's a skill set all in its own, just managing the adrenaline dump and being in that environment and the energy you get from other people when you're rolling with them in a competitive setting is completely different than, even when you're trying to be competitive with the people that you know.
Because there's even within commercial Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu gyms, there's like the competition school and the school that's just more about training and it doesn't compete because they're two different skill sets. So the competition school is very good at coaching you for competition and they'll go there and help you through the process. So then for you, being mostly self-study, wasn't that intimidating at first because you didn't have people there to like help you with the competition aspect, what to expect, how to feel? You basically had to be your own comp coach.
Yeah, for sure. I had some people who would show up and kind of help me out, but they didn't necessarily have an intimate knowledge of my game and my skill set. So it's a lot of just kind of picking up on advice from other people, connections that I've made online for people letting you know what to expect. And basically just, especially the first few times you go out, not to be too hard on yourself for your performance there. But also, I'm a bit of a sandbagger in that I've only got a blue belt after, 3.5 years of training and pretty good competitive success.
So for you to be so self-motivated to go out and compete, train all the time, watch all the stuff, you must have really developed a love for martial arts and in particular Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I try not to use the word obsessed, but that's, that's really what it is. I'm very hyper focused on it. I think when people get attached to it, they kind of get that bug of like, oh, I wish I had done this sooner. And it's almost like you got to make up for lost time.
So even with starting your training collective to competing, then, there was a lot of intimidation factor at first, starting something as a beginner or competing without being backed by like a very prestigious school. But sounds like then your enthusiasm and love for Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu and martial arts was so great that you couldn't help yourself.
Yeah, for sure. And I also think that, I had other skills that kind of prepped me for being, maybe uniquely able to pick up certain things about jiu-jitsu and martial arts quicker than other people. I trained parkour for 10 years. I did skateboarding for 10 years before that. And that's a lot of the same kind of watching other people do things, slowing it down frame by frame, reading people's descriptions of them on forums to try to like mimic it. And so the kind of skills that it took to watch and also hear how to perform a movement and translate that into my own body movements was something that I had for a long time, as well as just general internet abilities to find solutions to the problems that I was looking for.
Do you think it also helped as far as competition goes, where maybe, especially with skateboarding, maybe it's not a huge crowd of people, but you're used to doing stuff while people are watching you? Do you think that helped you prepare for competition at all?
Yeah, that's actually an interesting point. It's very similar to skateboarding in that people aren't actually watching you.
But you think they are.
Yeah, exactly. You go to a skate park and you think, oh, everyone's going to think I'm, a big poser if I don't, tear this up right out of the gate. But in reality, no one's actually watching you. So it's very similar in that sense that the pressure that you're putting on is mostly coming from yourself.
Nobody's really watching you, but you think you are, but you're in a public space. And what's the worst thing you want to do in a public space, right? If I'm walking down, a crowded place, I don't want to fall because that's embarrassing. But with parkour and skateboarding, there's always a risk of wiping out. And so I'm sure you have wiped out in public spaces. And so what's the worst thing of competition in Brazilian jiu-jitsu? Wiping out, really losing badly, right? So I wonder if there's also some of that. It's okay to wipe out in a public space.
Yeah, for sure. I think that understanding what failure actually is and what it isn't is something that has definitely translated from those things into martial arts, right? If you, I don't look at losing a match or messing up a move or something necessarily as failing, so much as not trying your best is really what's failing, and not learning from a loss is what the real failure is. If you lose a match and it's really dramatic, or maybe it's not, maybe you just got controlled the whole time. If you come away with that and you're making excuses or not using that as an opportunity to identify a weakness in your game that you can improve upon, then that's what's really the failure.
A note to our loyal listeners: if you love the show, please support us and help us get paid for our labor by joining Team Southpaw on Patreon. By becoming a member, you'll get access to bonus content like exclusive articles, fight previews, bonus episodes, transcripts of fight studies, and access to our private chat group on Discord. But more importantly, you will help us supplement the cost of the show, the incredible time and energy Sam and I put into making the show, and you'll be giving us some breathing room not only to juggle Southpaw with our day jobs, but also expand Southpaw into other areas. Show your Southpaw solidarity by supporting us at patreon.com/southpawpod.
Now let's talk about UFC 250.
Whew.
And let's start with the first fight on the main card. Eddie Wineland versus Sean O'Malley, which is one of several bantamweight fights that appear to be an unofficial contenders tournament. Now, this is a fight between a seasoned veteran versus up-and-coming prospect. The end came at 1 minute and 54 seconds of the first round with a Mark Hunt-style walkaway KO by Sean O'Malley. What were your thoughts about how the fight went down and the performances of both fighters?
Yeah, this was a quick one, and Sean looked really, really good. I don't think he threw the same thing twice, but even, the same feints, he just kind of did a different thing, a different combination, a different movement at every single step. And it was just really impressive. I don't have a lot of technical things to say about that. I really liked the way that he was framing on Wineland to throw shots. I think there was just one moment where he really did that. He did a lot of circling.
What do you mean by framing?
So he had, I think it was his lead arm, his left hand extended out, framing just like his hand right on his head or neck or something, and just holding that distance as Wineland, I think, tried to get closer. And just, most people measure distance with kind of a probing jab, and he was just right in there, almost like a football player, like, putting his arm straight out, holding that distance, and then using that to land a shot after removing that arm.
Oh, okay, so like kind of how a football player uses a stiff arm to create distance.
Yeah, exactly. It looked just like that. And then he did the same thing when he threw a kick that missed. I think he spun around and fell down, and then he put that frame right back up and was able to get up off the ground really quickly.
Did you feel like Wineland was doing okay, at least in the first minute, especially with his right straight? It seemed like, I don't know if rocked is the right word, but Sean O'Malley definitely was hurt at one point from a right hand.
Yeah, for sure. He did. I think it was a pretty good counter that he landed, and it did look pretty stiff. But yeah, he was definitely in it until he wasn't.
I mean, it's hard to say it was a competitive fight up until that point because it was so short. But the first, I would say, minute and a half, it was competitive.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't know who was going to win. It just looked like they're both doing stuff. Then you saw the payoff of everything Sean O'Malley was doing, all the setups he was doing, all the feints was setting up the end, and you didn't know it until the end came.
Yep. Yeah, it was really impressive.
To your point, I think it was ultimately a feint, a different kind of feint than one he was using previously that set up the end.
Yeah, I believe he showed an uppercut and then just went right over with an overhand.
So that was a short one. Next, we have Neil Magny versus Anthony Rocco Martin. Now, Magny has been trading wins and losses lately, while Martin has been on a bit of a streak outside of a close decision loss to Maia. So this fight ended up being a competitive decision victory for Magny. So can you break down the fight for us?
Yeah, I could do my best. This was honestly one that I had kind of forgot about until I rewatched them this morning. But there was a lot of interesting things that happened in this fight. Magny was doing really good with throwing volume and being really technical. But Martin was really impressive in forcing the clinch. And even when he wasn't the one forcing it, he was still turning it around on the fence and holding Magny up against the fence pretty effectively throughout the whole thing. In the second round, he used that to get a nice big takedown that Magny was able to work back up from, and also used an interesting Kimura to escape a back body lock. I really liked how he disengaged off of that rather than trying to hold on and commit to it.
In second viewing, did you think the fight was a lot closer than the first time you watched it? Because I remember Rocco was very surprised that he didn't win. And I don't know. I mean, it seemed pretty clear Magny won, but you've watched it twice. So what did you think the second time around?
Yeah, so in that last round, if you were judging it as a whole fight, absolutely, the decision was correct. But it did kind of look like Martin had done enough in the first two rounds to secure at least one of the rounds. Certainly the second round, he got that takedown. He was controlling a lot of the action. I think they gave it to Magny for those first two, just out of volume of strikes, really. Martin was kind of hitting some bigger, maybe more damaging shots, but that's a very subjective thing. You can't really say. Whereas Magny was doing a much better job of mixing up with the low kicks as well as the punches. One thing that I thought was really interesting in the last round was Martin was able to get a body lock that was almost in the middle of the ring and pushed forward and got a leg reap for that would have been probably a clear takedown had the ring been larger, but since they ran out of space, they was right into the fence, and then it ended up not working out, and Magny went right back to doing what he was doing.
Yeah, that is the interesting thing about the smaller cage, is that we're definitely seeing a lot more finishes and probably less engagement on the ground. And even the ground fighting wasn't really ground fighting. It was like a lot of stuff happened against the cage because they would run into the cage so quickly.
Yep.
So then you would do a submission or at least a submission attempt without even going to the ground. So to your point, then the cage seems like in a way not as good for ground fighting.
Yeah, it definitely presents some new challenges for that.
One of the things that they were talking about during the broadcast is how Rocco Martin had gained some weight. He was in the same weight division, but he had put on more muscle by working with a new nutritionist, maybe a different strength person. And one of the things that the broadcasters kept talking about was how tired he looked. And I wonder if some of that is sometimes when you put on more muscle, you're not so used to fighting with more muscle. And is that necessarily, I don't buy into the idea that more muscle means you get tired, but maybe because you know you're stronger now and you have put on some muscle in training, you've been wanting to use your strength a little bit more because you're proud of it, right?
Yeah.
So I wonder if since he's aware he's gotten stronger, he's fallen in love with his new strength. So he was using it more, which inadvertently tired him out more.
Yeah, I definitely think you can make a case for that. He was doing much more explosive movements than Magny was doing, definitely not being as conservative with his energy.
And that's definitely dangerous against Magny, who builds over the rounds, and he's known to never tire out.
Yeah, he looked fresh at the end of that.
Magny kind of reminds me of Michael Bisping in a way where he kind of builds over time. He hits you with the 1-2. That's like his main thing, but doesn't have that destructive knockout power. So do you think Magny's greatest tool is cardio, or does he have more to him than just like an endless gas tank?
I think the gas tank plays into his ability to mix things up. You mentioned his 1-2 being his kind of go-to thing, but he was throwing in a lot of those low leg kicks that we love talking about, and his kind of ability to go from high to low with those combinations, I think fits that style really, really well.
And I think that's kind of a new modern MMA thesis that people are employing, is going high, low. Whereas before you saw a lot of just headhunting, and a lot of people still just headhunt, but some of the newer fighters, they're really mixing things up where they're trying to hit every part of the body now.
Yeah, it's a beautiful thing. I'm really liking that evolution of the sport.
So next we have Aljamain Sterling versus Corey Sandhagen, which could easily headline a fight night card. Both fighters needed this win to say they're next in line for the title. So it's surprising this wasn't the co-main event. Now, this is another fight that didn't last long, with Sterling winning by rear naked choke under 2 minutes of the first round. So I know there wasn't a lot to watch, but what were your thoughts and impressions about this fight?
Well, me being a jiu-jitsu person, going back and watching this was actually the one I took the most notes on, because there was a lot of really interesting things happening very, very quickly.
Really?
Yeah. So it started out, Sterling just came out right out the gate with a ton of pressure, mostly with his movement, a lot of side to side, just corralling Sandhagen up against the fence. Again, we saw those low kicks to kind of steer him in the way that he wanted. And then when Sandhagen tried to return fire, Sterling caught the leg kick with that kind of single leg grip and then just pushed him into the fence. He went right up to the higher part of the body to hold him against the fence, using a really strong underhook in that clinch. And then he had an inside leg that he used to kind of start to trip Sandhagen to the ground. And rather than getting that all the way to the ground, he kind of used that trip motion with his underhook to slip that leg out so that he could then circle around to the back. Once he was on the back, he just jumped the back, which was really surprising to me. It's not something that you see being very successful on standing opponents very often, but maybe just because it was the beginning of the fight and they weren't as sweaty, he was able to stay on there. But also going back and rewatching it, he used a great trick that I've only seen Danaher talk about in his back instructionals, which is using asymmetrical hooks, where he has one hook that's basically just a foot on the inside of the thigh, and then the other one is longer, where you're basically knee deep, and that prevents you from being shucked off the top in the way that most people do when someone jumps on your back. They kind of lean forward and kind of try to get you to fall forward off of them. Having those asymmetrical hooks really, really digs you in there so that it's very difficult to get you off of there. And then from there, he just went right to attacking the choke. He almost had it with that over the jaw, but couldn't quite get his locking hand behind the head, which is super, super essential in MMA with those gloves. It's just really, really difficult to get it tight enough where someone can't peel away your locking hand unless you get your hand all the way behind the head. So Sandhagen was doing good defensively. He was doing a lot of things that were, the right thing to do. He was pushing up. He got the initial choking grip off. It wasn't quite tight enough because of those hand positions. So as soon as Sandhagen was able to get that grip off and he pushed the choking hand off of his jaw, Sterling switched to an underhook control on the back. So basically, he dove a hand under Sandhagen's bottom side arm so that he can control that wrist.
Kind of like what you were mentioning before with Khabib, right? Like kind of a wrist ride you're talking about?
Yeah, you can do that straight from someone's back. And even if you're on your back, you can hold that. And it does a really good job of preventing the person from turning in either direction, especially if you're on that side. You really need that to prevent their shoulders from getting out too quickly. He was also doing a really good job holding a super tight body triangle, and I don't know how much of a factor that was, but the upper body fight is really where all of the things were happening. So once he got control of that bottom hand with the wrist, he went just straight to striking at the head from behind, which I think is really, really interesting. A big difference, obviously between MMA and jiu-jitsu is those strikes, and striking someone when you're on their back does a lot to present an additional threat. So they're having to think about the strangle, they're having to think about escaping the position, and now they're also having to think about getting struck. So there's this triple threat of things that can be happening all at once that you can't even see because the person's behind you. Sterling then pulled him back into kind of a claw grip. And at this point, Sandhagen had an opportunity potentially to get out. He had...
Can you explain what a claw grip is?
So it's basically like when you're on somebody's back, and if your head isn't in the right position, if your head is on the same side as your overhooking arm, you need to correct that head position. Otherwise, it's very, very difficult to put a strangle in. And it also, the other person can start bringing their head and their shoulders to the mat in a way that's difficult to control. So basically just gripping with your overhooking arm to the back of the trapezius and using that to pull them kind of back on top of you, or to shovel yourself underneath so that you can either switch to your other side underhooking arm, or to grab the wrist on the other side. It's just a way to kind of pull the person back on. And you can also potentially use it to switch to an arm triangle if things go further south.
So are you saying then your hand is kind of like grabbing their trap like a claw?
Yeah.
To yank them backwards?
Yeah. So Sandhagen at that point almost had his head out.
Yeah. When I was watching, I thought that's it. He's going to get out.
Yeah. And then Sterling did something really interesting where he started punching him with the underhooking arm. I don't know that I've ever seen someone do that. So the arm that he had the wrist ride on, he started kind of throwing these punches from underneath of Sandhagen's armpit up into his head.
Like kind of like an uppercut?
Yep, just like that. It was like a uppercut from the back, essentially. Just like you're punching yourself in the face, but there's another face in the way.
Mm-hmm.
So he used that as a threat to keep Sandhagen's head away from that side where he could have potentially escaped, and that squared them back up to a position where Sandhagen was directly on top of Sterling. Sterling then used that as an opportunity to recapture a seatbelt around him and pull him back into that back control. Sandhagen did a really good job at that point of establishing a 2-on-1 on the overhooking arm, and went to the overhooking side so that he could pull that arm across and start again. Almost had his shoulders out there. Could have easily gotten out at that point in a grappling scenario, but I think he was concerned about ending up on the bottom of mount and getting struck. Sterling was doing a really good job of maintaining height at that position. And so rather than using that 2-on-1 to try to turn in, he went to his knees. And that's really where the beginning of the end was here. After going up to his knees, he really didn't have anything to defend his neck. Both of his hands were planted, and Sterling was able to get that arm fully around the neck and under the jaw that time. And when they rolled back over, Sterling was able to get the locking arm in place, and notably got the locking arm behind the head and covered his own wrist with his chin to just get that super, super deep. And then it was over.
I think another thing that factored into it is something we just already discussed, is the smaller cage. Because I think Sandhagen was surprised how quickly he got pushed against the fence, because it only took like Sterling a couple of steps to get him into the cage. So I think he was surprised that his back was against the fence. And then at that point, when Sterling knew Sandhagen couldn't go backwards anymore, he jumped on his back. I don't even think Sandhagen was aware that there was a threat for somebody to jump to your back from only taking like 3 or 4 steps back from the center of the cage. You know what I mean?
Yeah, for sure. If you're a person who likes to keep people at a range, you have to have an answer for someone who's going to come in and charge you at that smaller cage. You can't just circle step. You have to kind of meet them with something, maybe a teep or your own leg kicks or something to stop that forward pressure.
I think also Sterling, recognizing that the cage is so small and they're constantly going to run into the cage, he didn't even drop down for a takedown, because he's like, what's the point? They're going to keep wall walking out, right? They're going to just shimmy up the cage. I can't take people down, so I'm just going to jump on the back.
Yeah, he had that perfect opportunity where he almost had that trip with the inside leg, and then when Sandhagen recovered his base, he still had that underhook and was able to just slip around behind him.
The fight reminded me of a situation you see a lot in jiu-jitsu, right? Where you slap hands and roll, and you think you're going to flow, but the other person is going 100%, right?
Oh, yeah.
You think you're going light, but the other person's like, nuh-uh, and taps you in 30 seconds. Especially with having his back taken, Sandhagen looked really relaxed. And I think even in the round, I think Sandhagen initially, when they were standing, just wanted to feel Sterling out. Whereas Sterling wanted to capitalize on that moment at the beginning of every fight where you don't know anything about each other, and was just like, you don't know me, I don't know you, so I'm just going to put you away before you can figure me out.
Yeah, you really have to have an answer for someone who wants to come in and pressure you immediately. It's something you experience as an early jiu-jitsu practitioner in competition as well. You inevitably will come up against someone, especially if you're in the Midwest, who has a wrestling background and has that competitive background and is going to just come out the gate really, really fast. And if you don't have something to put up against that, if you don't have a wall to put up against that, and you certainly don't have the space to move out of the way in the smaller cage, then it can be really, really overwhelming.
From my first watch, it felt like, is Sandhagen being too lackadaisical? Is there no sense of urgency that his back is taken? Because he looked really calm and relaxed. And I was wondering, maybe that's why he ended up getting choked, because he wasn't taking it seriously enough. He's like, it's okay, I'm fine, I'm going to get out. Now, watching it technique by technique, was that the case, that he was just kind of too relaxed and not sensing the danger? Or was it just more like Aljamain had an answer for everything Sandhagen was doing and was just kind of confusing him with his level of jiu-jitsu?
I really think it was Sterling just out having an answer for everything that Sandhagen was doing. He wasn't necessarily doing anything wrong. He was almost out in a couple places. He had his shoulders, misaligned in a couple places. But Sterling just really was doing a great job mixing up the positional threat with the striking threat, with the choking threat. And it's just too much.
If you watch a lot of MMA fights, right? Normally, some of those positions that Sandhagen put himself in, where he was kind of like in a weird angle, or his head was in a certain position, or he's like pulling away and breaking the hand grips, 90% of the time in MMA, that person gets out.
Yeah, most of the time you don't see someone on someone's back until it's much later in the fight, right? It's because they've gotten to a point where they've, felt each other out on the feet enough. Someone's gotten a takedown, and you've usually done some grounded pounding as well before you actually have an opportunity to be on someone's back. But this was so early that a lot of those other strategies that will work when you're more slippery, and maybe the other person isn't able to be as technical or as strong as they could be in that scenario, just wasn't available. It wouldn't work the same.
So later on in fights, you might be able to get out, not only because of the sweat factor, so you're able to slip out, but the person trying to put the submission on you is more fatigued at that point. So they're not going to be as tight either. So it's slipperiness and fatigue of the attacking grappler.
Absolutely.
Now let's get to the co-main event. We have Rafael Assunção versus Cody Garbrandt. Now you have the former champion in Garbrandt versus perennial contender Assunção, both now on a losing streak and both in desperate need, frankly, of a win to stay relevant. You could argue this is a loser leave town match. Now, Cody ended up winning in the final second of the second round with a one-punch knockout. What did you think about this matchup?
I was really interested to see this matchup. Cody is one of those fighters that I have followed for a little bit. There's just so much drama and intrigue behind everything in his career that I was really looking forward to seeing which Cody showed up, what he looked like. And it was kind of a toss-up. I thought he did just amazing. He looked really, really disciplined. He's clearly switched up some of his coaching staff, and it's just looked like he was doing all the right things. He wasn't getting sucked into the kind of brawling that he used to usually do when he would find success. He backed off and kept going at his combinations, his feints. He looked fast. He looked like composed. It's a Cody that I'm glad we get to see.
Yeah, I think you're basically pointing out what a lot of people who've been watching Garbrandt have thought is there isn't analytically anything you need to like point out as far as like things he does bad, physical attributes wise to also technical skill wise. He's like incredible, right? So it's not like he had all these flaws in his game. I think with him, it seemed more of an issue with his mindset. He would lose his composure. He would get angry in a fight and then just throw away everything he knows and even misuse his abilities. And so in this fight, he didn't do that.
Yeah, he looked really good.
I did notice, and I'm sure you noticed this too, that he was fighting a lot more from the outside than he normally did, even in, his fights where it was classic Cody. And there's no way to know whether that was all from training with his new team in Mark Henry, or it was just from getting knocked out in his last 3 fights and he was just more tentative of being in close range now.
Yeah.
But definitely there was that change in his range where he was fighting from further out than he normally does. And yeah, I mean, he did get knocked out 3 times.
Yeah, I definitely think it's a bit of both. I think he had a little bit of a wake-up call and, kind of got more disciplined. And he was also able to find in Mark Henry a coach who can kind of play to his strengths and someone that he trusts and can make, good reads for him when he's, maybe not always able to do that himself. Yeah, I also really liked his kind of super low level change to low leg kick that he was throwing out there. That just looked really fun. I don't know that I've seen any other fighters doing that.
Yeah, he was like actually level changing and he actually went for takedowns this fight, which he normally never does.
Yeah, it was really interesting the way he was almost like feinting a takedown and then throwing like a Karate Kid sweep the leg sort of thing.
So using a shot to set up a low kick, I don't think I've seen that before. Because usually when you do that, you use that to set up like an overhand or some kind of punching technique, but not some low kick. You wouldn't think to use the wrestling shot to set up your kick, but he was doing it and it was really effective actually.
It was. It looked like really hard shots, and I'm sure he could turn it into a wrestling shot if the situation presented itself.
I think it might be one of those moves now that other fighters have seen it, that it becomes more common. That's the same thing that happened with the low kick. Is it was a lot of people from the MMA lab started using it, and then once like their highest profile fighter, Benson Henderson, was using it in his title fights, people were like, "Oh, I should do that too."
Yeah, it also kind of reminds me of a new trend you see in jiu-jitsu now, where people are wrestling up from a seated guard or taking kind of like a really, really low stance. Saw Nick Rodriguez do that a few times in ADCC, where he'd get all the way down into like a complete squat, but like with one knee down, where he could potentially just blast into you, or sit to a guard if he needed to.
Now, one observation I'd credit this to Mark Henry, is that Cody Garbrandt looked a lot more like Frankie Edgar in this fight, where he was circling a lot the way Frankie does. And normally Cody really sits down, like not just when he punches, his stance is kind of lower because he wants to load up on his hooks. His height difference between Azunsao shouldn't be that great. Like, I think they might be even the same height, but he looked taller than Azunsao because Azunsao was fighting in his typical lower stance. And Cody was standing so much more upright, like I said, like Frankie Edgar does, which I think gave him a lot more mobility to circle, fight on the outside, and be more in and out. And so I think that's classic Mark Henry.
Yeah, I really liked his movement in this.
Now let's talk about Azunsao a little bit, because I mean, I've been a fan of his for a long time, not just because he's good, but he's kind of like that movie, The Bad News Bears, where it's like the lovable loser, where he just can't quite get there to that title fight. He is probably the best bantamweight to never fight for the title. And he's also had 2 competitive fights with TJ Dillashaw. He also has a win over Marlon Moraes. He actually has a lot of wins, but he hasn't been looking too good lately. And I think for Azunsao, a lot of that is something he didn't used to do in the past. Is now he's chasing people, but he's like chasing them and then just waiting there. And then they'll feint him, and then he'll bite on the feints. And then from there, that's where the bad things happen, where he got knocked out in this fight. He loses the decision. He gets hurt and choked out by Moraes. So it is interesting to see a veteran over time fall into bad habits that they didn't have previously. And I think kind of like Cody, where if you lose, you start doubting yourself a little bit. So you make a stylistic change, or you react in ways that you normally wouldn't do, which is like with Cody, he fights further out, which is actually a good improvement. I think with Azunsao, he has the opposite, where he's overreacting because of the way he lost. So he's like overreacting to feints too much because those losses are in the back of his mind. So it'll be interesting if he improves from this fight, or this is like the start of his downward skid, where maybe physically he hasn't deteriorated, but just as far as his confidence in the fight, it's not the same anymore.
Yeah, at that level, it's really hard to say, how much adjustments you should make after a loss. When you're kind of just starting out, you're really learning where your holes are. But when you get up and up and up, the differences are usually, less and less between the fighters. So if you try to make a radical change after something to compensate for something, you might be losing some of the things you were doing well before. But the flip side of that is, you'll see someone like Ben Askren comment on that and say, why would I change up what I'm doing just because I got knocked out once? And then
yeah. Now let's talk about the main event, with champion Amanda Nunes defending her featherweight title for the first time against Felicia Spencer, which ended up being a dominant decision victory for Nunes. And unlike some of the other fights we talked about, we have more minutes to analyze, and a lot of it was actually contested on the ground, right? So that's like your wheelhouse. So I'm laughing because it was so dominant, but could you walk us through the fight?
It was interesting because it just was kind of the same thing round after round.
It was rinse and repeat.
Yeah. Nunes was just highly dominant with the striking. Spencer, tried to kind of take it to the ground. I think the commentators were saying that maybe that's where she would have some kind of an edge, citing her, Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu black belt. But Nunes is also a Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu black belt, and she's a judo brown belt, which came out, really abundantly in those times where Spencer did try to take her down. Every single takedown attempt that Spencer put out there, Amanda shut down or often reversed. Amanda wasn't really trying to take Spencer down, but there was opportunities, and there was a couple ones where she would literally just chuck her to the ground and then wait for Spencer to get back up. I think that was maybe the only thing that, one of the only things that disappointed me about the fight, but probably the only thing that I would say in Amanda's performance that I wasn't super thrilled about was her hesitancy to go to the ground. I think, obviously that was because she knew that she had the ability to finish it on the feet pretty easily. But I would have liked to have seen her kind of maybe put a little bit more of a statement on that, especially after 4 rounds of the beating that she put on Spencer.
I think there's this bias where if you specialize in one thing, like you are really good at this one thing, even though you're an overall MMA fighter, this is your wheelhouse, right? So for Spencer, it's the ground, it's the jiu-jitsu. Then there's this bias then that the specialist is better at their one thing than the well-rounded fighter. And the reason why I call that a bias is because maybe Spencer's best thing is Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu and being on the ground, but her best thing is still not better than Amanda's abilities on the ground. I think maybe Amanda might be even better than her on the ground. So your best thing is still worse than the champion's second best thing.
For sure.
So then what do you do?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a difficult conundrum there. She didn't have the striking in order to mix it up into the entries and the takedowns that she needed to get on the ground on her own terms. I think Spencer did do a pretty good job when she was on the ground, and maybe Amanda felt that, and that's why she didn't continue to try to pursue that. Spencer did do a pretty good job a couple times recovering guard and keeping herself safe, but there really wasn't, much of a threat there, even when she was there.
If you watch Amanda Nunes versus Germaine de Randamie is not a specialist on the ground, but there were several times where de Randamie almost got a submission on Nunes, whereas in this fight, Spencer didn't come anywhere close.
Yeah, and you're definitely right about the specialist thing not being necessarily as good as someone who's better at mixing them all together. You might be really, really good at grappling, but if you're not really, really, really good at grappling when someone's striking you, or getting it there under those conditions, it doesn't do you the same amount of. It doesn't go as far as you'd like it to.
Yeah, I think with Germaine de Randamie, right, if she were to just roll with Felicia Spencer, just pure jiu-jitsu, I'm sure she would get clobbered. But in that fight, because she is a striker and has fought a lot of MMA, I think she had a composure when she was getting hit in the face by Nunes to be like, okay, I'm getting hit, but I can absorb this and stay calm to try to set up an armbar or whatever. Whereas I think with Spencer, because she has trained jiu-jitsu so much, her instinct was to go straight away to defensive grappling, which is like recover, get full guard, create space, whatever. Is more thinking like that instead of sacrifice taking the hits to try to set up a submission.
Yeah, and we saw kind of a similar thing with
Chase Hooper.
Yeah, Chase Hooper earlier. Trying to jump a closed guard, that doesn't work very often. You need a lot more integrated ways to get it to the ground than that. And even if you are successful being offensive from that position, it takes a whole bunch of extra steps.
Now, were you okay with this fight going all 5 rounds, or would you have been okay if it got stopped somewhere before?
I definitely would have liked to have seen it stopped, if not earlier, certainly between rounds 4 and 5. I don't know what the judges were looking at with the lack of 10-8 rounds that ended up in the scorecards. And I know that that's not like a necessarily a reason to stop a fight. But yeah, I really wish that there was incentive for corners and fighters to prioritize their longevity over this like warrior spirit or whatever the fuck it is.
I know. It's like, don't kill yourself for a company that isn't even going to take care of your healthcare, you know?
Yeah, it's ridiculous.
I think even Amanda didn't know Felicia Spencer's real age. That's why she was giving her this talk that you're real young and you're going to have the championship one day. That's why she even said, do you want to hold the belt? But what she was trying to say is because you're young in the game, you're a young person, one day you'll be champion. But looking up Felicia Spencer online, she's actually not that young. She's 29. I mean, that's young as far as like regular life goes.
Yeah.
But as far as MMA, that's not young, especially if you're not like a heavyweight. You could be 29 and young as a heavyweight, but any division below heavyweight, 29, it basically means you're a fully developed fighter.
Yeah.
You know, like you were mentioning before, at this level of the game, and especially at 29 and already having skill sets you're good at, you don't want to and you shouldn't overhaul your whole fighting system, your whole style. So do you think there are some areas that needs addressing for Spencer that could help her going forward?
I mean, I did watch the Cyborg fight,
which was a lot of the
yeah,
same.
basically the same thing. It's hard to say something that she could add technically, but I think just being a little bit more confident in throwing out a combination of things and keeping it going, even against that pressure. You could see her kind of freezing and retreating a lot of times where, Nunes was just doing her thing. And I understand, right? If someone can advance on you and counterpunch you, it's very difficult to, throw out things, even feints, but you just have to do it. Otherwise you're going to get so outworked like that there's no chance to add anything in there.
Yeah. She kind of reminds me of Anthony Smith, not in skill set, but as far as like just talking about the psychology of fighting. Because I think for broadcasters and even for fans and people online and even analysts, we don't really analyze what toughness means. We just say because she lasted so long and she took so much punishment, like Lionheart can take so much punishment, they're automatically tough, which they are. But I think there's a difference between toughness and confidence. So I think in both of those fighters, you have somebody who's extremely tough, can take a lot of punishment and not quit, will be there to the very end, while at the same time that they're being tough throughout the fight, show some lack of confidence. Like, I want to prove something to myself, a moral victory that I could last to the end, but I'm not quite sure if I trust in my hands or in my abilities, or should I really attack or not? I don't know, like almost like an imposter syndrome. Like if I try something, what if I look stupid, or what if it doesn't work, or what if they really are better than me, but I'm going to last to the end and I'm not going to quit on myself. There are definitely fighters who are tough and also confident, like Justin Gaethje, where to the very end, not only is he tough, but he believes in himself. Whereas I would say with certain fighters, like Felicia Spencer, it seemed like she has the toughness without that confidence.
Yeah, she's definitely durable.
Yeah.
But yeah, you need options, things that you've trained that you use when things aren't going your way. And I think a lot of people just train, your A game or whatever it is that you want to do to the other person. But you need to also have a lot of training and experience for what happens when those things go wrong. And if you don't have something that you can pull out in those other kinds of situations, you're going to end up, just kind of frozen.
Yeah, I think one of the most ironic moments in the whole fight is when she's getting beat up. They should actually throw in the towel, but her corner doesn't. And so that's why, because they didn't throw in the towel, I feel okay in kind of criticizing them. But they said to her, okay, now remember the game plan. You got to stick to the game plan. So instead of throwing in the towel, they send her out there telling her to remember the game plan. And I'm like, what is the game plan here?
Yeah, you got to switch it up. You got to do something different.
Yeah, because her sticking with her game plan isn't working. So why do you still believe it's working?
Yeah, and that's where having, coaches who can make those very quick reads during those high pressure rounds and communicate them to you are really an advantage.
Now, for Amanda Nunes, what would you like to see for her next?
Oh my goodness. I don't know. She's done basically everything she can do in the UFC. She could certainly make a bunch more money in boxing if she went there, and she definitely has the hands for it.
I think if you really like Amanda, if you're a big fan of hers, you just want her to get a big payday now.
Yeah.
Her legacy is set. There's nothing left for her to prove. But I think for this fight, I don't think she came anywhere near $1 million purse. And you see fighters in boxing who are not nearly as notable as far as like celebrity or well known as Amanda, who are making 2 times, 3 times, 4 times, like 10 times, 12 times more money than her. And so it's kind of sad that she's the greatest of all time, yet she's not being paid like the greatest of all time. You mentioned the boxing. I think a lot of us now, we don't need to see her in MMA anymore. If she does, great. I mean, I'll watch her, but we don't need her to prove anything to us anymore, I should say. So I would love to see a huge payday fight for actually both fighters, her and Clarissa Shields. I think that could set a record for women's boxing, I think. That could be bigger than the UFC. That could just be something that goes down in the history of just combat sports, period.
Yeah, that would be great. And how amazing would that be for someone to start out in, grappling, a Brazilian jiu-jitsu black belt, goes into the UFC, becomes a ridiculously amazing striker, and then goes into, pure striking to finish out her career.
That is a good point, because if you watch her early fights, she was not a striker. She was a grappler.
Not at all, yeah.
So how quickly she developed her striking, and to the point where she was just better than Cyborg. And Cyborg's gone out and done professional kickboxing and Muay Thai. So, to see Amanda go out and do boxing, I mean, that would really set her legacy now, where it wouldn't be just a UFC legacy, but just like her own legacy.
Yeah, that's really, one of the only things that I think Shevchenko has on her that, continues to keep her kind of in that conversation is her, kickboxing championships. And if Amanda goes and does something like that in a striking art like boxing, just further solidifies her as the greatest of all time.
So now we've had several UFC events without an audience. How is that experience? How have you liked these fights?
I've liked them a lot. I definitely think that the audience can, add some of an excitement factor. But I think for me personally as a viewer, the presence or lack of an audience doesn't make a huge difference. But where I think it makes a really big difference is just in the quality of the fights. When the fighters can hear their corners and hear what they're saying, and maybe they're able to keep a little bit calmer in those environments, it just results in better fights, which is a lot more viewer friendly in the end.
You bring up a good point. The technical skill of all these fights have gone up. Like even the prelim fighters, they just all look more technical, and I think it's because they're not, like what we were talking about earlier, as far as competition mindset, they're not as distracted by this idea that people are watching them, and also they could hear their coaches.
Yeah, it makes a big difference. I'm really enjoying it. And then, you also have commentators coming in as assistant coaches from time to time.
Yeah. I don't think Joe Rogan is that helpful, because I don't think he knows anything. And to another point, he's called out the Japanese necktie, like, I don't know how many times he said it's coming, and it's never come. So,
oh my goodness.
Yeah, he's not going to be a help. But sometimes like DC will give really poignant tips. And so I think
for sure
that really does help fighters who can hear him, because he knows what he's talking about.
Can you imagine Dominic Cruz commentating on a card and you can hear every word he says?
He's amazing as commentator, unless it's like one of his own fighters. If it's like somebody from his team, he's like completely biased,
Yeah.
For my own part, I actually am not neutral about no audience. I actually prefer it. It is less distracting for me. I could actually just pay attention to the fight more. The only time I missed it is like the Cody Garbrandt knockout or the Sean O'Malley knockout, where you wanted that one punch knockout to be followed by like this roar from the crowd. That was like the only time where I was like, those knockouts like deserve a roar, but it didn't get that,
They need a roar track to play.
Yeah, because it was like, whoa, this like amazing walk away knockout, but it was like the crickets,
Yeah.
So that was the only time I found myself like, oh, okay, that's what the crowd is for, to kind of put a highlight on those moments,
Yeah, for sure.
Now, we mentioned this previously. Do you like the smaller cage, or are you ambivalent to it, or would you rather see them back in the big cage?
Probably somewhere between ambivalent to liking it. I think it's interesting in the way that it shapes the fights. I like seeing variations in the structures of different rule sets and environments and things like that. So I think it adds a new depth of things to compare to. I would say I do think that the fights are more exciting and you see a more variety of action happening in them. So if they keep it, I'm certainly on board. But I think the main value in it for me as someone who's trying to like learn from watching fights is in comparing it to what things looked like before and how that changes strategies, who it favors, who it doesn't. And we're still kind of accumulating that data, but it's been really cool.
Yeah, it does kind of give it a fighting in a phone booth vibe.
For sure. I would really like to, I always like to see him fight, but I'd be really interested to see how someone like Ryan Hall adapts his style to a much smaller environment.
Because he is such a submission specialist, I think it's really hard for him to fight because nobody wants to fight him. And I think the UFC isn't like peer pressuring fighters to take a fight with him either. So he's like in a weird place.
Yeah, and his striking comes from really, really far away. He really likes head kicks, spinning side kicks and stuff. So for him to go up against someone, is a different weight class, but someone like Aljamain Sterling who would just put a ton of pressure on him really fast, I'd be interested to see what he does when he can't run away or maybe not have as much room to roll.
Hopefully we'll see him soon. I think he averages one fight every 2 years. So
yeah, something like that.
All right. Well, this was fun, Jacky. Now, tell us about how people can support your work.
So they can, I have a Patreon. It's patreon.com/queer-self-defense. They can sign up there for any range of things to donate and support the work that I'm doing. For the months of June and May, I'm donating everything I'm getting from that, as well as some more personal funds from my day job to George Floyd Memorial Fund, bail funds, street medics, whatever's coming across my feed that seems like it needs attention right now.
Awesome. Then I'll put all of that in the show notes. All right. Thank you, Jacky.
Appreciate it, Sam.
Now that's the show. If you enjoyed this episode and find this type of independent media worthwhile, please consider supporting the show on Patreon. We have a lot more episodes like this one in the works, but need your financial support to keep the show running. Even a few dollars a month goes a long way. No one does what we do, and it's all being funded by you, the listener. In return for supporting us, you'll gain access to lots of bonus content and along with our private Discord chat. Even if you can't support us, there's a lot of free bonus content there as well. We also have an online store if you want to show your Southpaw solidarity by wearing our swag. You can find all pertinent links at southpawpod.com. And if you can't afford to support the show and still want to help, please leave us a 5-star review wherever you listen. This makes it easier for others to find us. And don't forget to share your favorite episodes or the podcast itself on social media. Tell your friends. Until next time, goodbye.